1945, a Harlem basement. Detroit Red knelt on the concrete floor, hands tied behind his back. 3 men stood over him with guns drawn. He owed money to people who didn't accept apologies. The room smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swinging slightly, casting shadows that danced across the concrete walls. Detroit Red was 19 years old. He had been in Harlem for 3 years, hustling, stealing, and making enemies he could not afford to make. Now those enemies wanted payment, not in money, in blood. The man holding the gun was named Carmine, a low-level enforcer for the Italian mob who ran numbers on the east side. Detroit Red had borrowed $500 from Carmine's boss 3 months ago. He had promised to pay it back with interest. He never did. Now Carmine pressed the barrel of his revolver against Detroit Red's forehead. The metal was cold. Detroit Red closed his eyes. He thought about his mother in the mental institution. He thought about his father, murdered by white supremacists when Malcolm was 6 years old. He thought about how his life had led to this basement. Then the door opened. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the basement like he owned it. Because in Harlem, he owned everything. He was 40 years old, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a white pocket square. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His eyes scanned the room, slowly taking in every detail. Carmine and his 2 associates turned their guns toward the doorway. But when they saw who it was, their weapons lowered slightly. Everyone in New York knew Bumpy Johnson. The Italians knew him especially well. He had been fighting them for 15 years, ever since he started working for Madame Stephanie St. Clair in the early 1930s. He had survived Dutch Schultz. He had survived police raids, prison sentences, and assassination attempts. He had built an empire in Harlem that the 5 families could not penetrate. And now he was standing in a basement on 127th Street, looking at 3 Italian enforcers who were about to execute a 19-year-old hustler. Bumpy did not speak immediately. He pulled out a cigar from his jacket pocket, bit off the end, and lit it with a silver lighter. The flame illuminated his face for a moment, calm, calculating, dangerous. Carmine found his voice first. "Mr. Johnson, this ain't your business. This kid owes money to people. He's got to pay." Bumpy took a long drag from his cigar. The smoke curled toward the ceiling. He looked at Detroit Red, still kneeling on the floor, hands tied, blood dripping from a cut above his eye where someone had pistol-whipped him. Then Bumpy looked back at Carmine. "How much does he owe?" Bumpy asked quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle. That softness was more terrifying than any shout. 500, plus interest, 750 total. Bumpy reached into his jacket. Carmine's men tensed, hands tightening on their weapons, but Bumpy did not pull a gun. He pulled out a roll of cash, thick as a man's fist, held together with a rubber band. He peeled off $800 bills and held them out. "There's 800. The extra 50 is for your trouble." Carmine stared at the money. He did not move to take it. "Mr. Johnson, with respect, this ain't about money anymore. The kid disrespected Mr. Castellano. He's got to be made an example." Bumpy's eyes went cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Let me explain something to you," Bumpy said, his voice still quiet. "This young man is now under my protection. Whatever debt he owed, I am paying it. Whatever disrespect he showed, I am apologizing for it, on his behalf." He took a step closer to Carmine. The enforcer was bigger than Bumpy, younger, armed, but he took a step backward anyway. "Now you have a choice," Bumpy continued. "You can take this money, walk out of here, and tell Mr. Castellano that the matter is settled. Bumpy Johnson settled it. Or you can refuse the money and we can see what happens next." The room was silent. Detroit Red watched from the floor, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He had heard stories about Bumpy Johnson. Everyone in Harlem had. The man who faced down Dutch Schultz. The man who made the Italian mob back down time and time again. the man they called the Godfather of Harlem. But Detroit Red had never seen him in person until this moment. And what he saw was something he would never forget. Power. Not the kind that came from guns or money. The kind that came from absolute certainty. Carmine looked at his two associates. They offered no help. Their eyes said what their mouths would not. Take the money and get out. This was not worth dying for. Carmine reached out and took the $800 from Bumpy's hand. I'll tell Mr. Castellano the debt is paid, Carmine said. Good, Bumpy replied. And Carmine, next time your people want to do business in Harlem, they come. To me first. This is my neighborhood. Not yours. Not Castellano's. Mine. We clear? Carmine nodded once, sharply. Then he gestured to his men. The three Italians walked past Bumpy, up the basement stairs, and out into the Harlem night. They would not return. The door closed behind them. Bumpy stood there for a long moment, smoking his cigar, looking at the young man, still kneeling on the floor. Detroit Red's hands were still tied. Blood was still dripping down his face, but his eyes were different now. Something had shifted in them. Fear had been replaced by something else. Curiosity, respect, maybe even hope. Bumpy walked over and knelt down. He pulled a knife from his pocket and cut the ropes binding Detroit Red's wrists. Stand up, Bumpy said. Detroit Red stood on shaking legs. He was tall, over 6 feet, but skinny. His red hair was disheveled, his clothes torn from the beating he had received. He looked like what he was, a young man who had been minutes away from death. What's your name? Bumpy asked. They call me Detroit Red. Bumpy studied him for a moment. That's not a name. That's a street handle. What did your mother name you? The young man hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone had asked him that question. Malcolm, he said finally. Malcolm Little. Bumpy nodded slowly. Malcolm. That's a good name. Strong name. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, white silk with his initials embroidered in the corner. He handed it to Malcolm. Clean yourself up. Malcolm took the handkerchief and pressed it against the cut above his eye. The blood soaked through the white fabric immediately. Why did you do that? Malcolm asked. His voice was hoarse. Why did you pay my debt? You don't even know me. Bumpy took another drag from his cigar before answering. I know you better than you think, Bumpy said. I've been watching you for 6 months. You're smart. Smarter than most of these fools running around Harlem pretending to be gangsters. You read books. You think before you act. Most of the time. He gestured to the basement around them. But you're also reckless. You take risks that don't make sense. You borrow money from people who will kill you for being a day late. You run your mouth when you should stay quiet. You act like a man who doesn't care if he lives or dies. Malcolm said nothing, because everything Bumpy said was true. Let me tell you something, Malcolm, Bumpy continued. These streets will eat you alive. I've seen it happen 100 times. Smart young men with potential, dead before they turn 25, shot in an alley, stabbed in a bar fight, beaten to death over a gambling debt. He pointed his cigar at Malcolm. That was almost you tonight, you understand that? Another 5 minutes and you would have been just another body. Malcolm swallowed hard. He understood. He had felt that gun barrel against his forehead. So, what do you want from me? Malcolm asked. His voice had an edge to it now, suspicious. Even after being saved, he did not trust easily. That kind of distrust was learned the hard way. I don't want anything from you, Bumpy said. I'm not buying you. I'm not recruiting you. I just paid a debt, that's all. He started walking toward the basement stairs, then stopped. He turned back to look at Malcolm one more time. But I will give you some advice, free of charge. You're too smart for this life. These streets, this hustling, this borrowing money, and running games, it's going to destroy you. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but soon. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. You've got a mind, Malcolm. Use it for something better than getting yourself killed. Then Bumpy Johnson walked up the stairs and disappeared into the Harlem night. Malcolm stood alone in that basement for a long time. The light bulb was still swinging. The blood from his face had dripped onto his shirt, staining it dark. He looked down at Bumpy's handkerchief in his hand, the white silk now crimson. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. He would keep that handkerchief for years. Malcolm did not take Bumpy's advice. At least, not immediately. Over the next year, he continued his hustling, his gambling, his running with dangerous men. He moved between Harlem and Boston, always one step ahead of the law, always making enemies he could not afford. In January 1946, Malcolm was arrested in Boston for burglary. The police found stolen goods worth thousands of dollars. They also found Malcolm with a white woman, which in 1946 America was considered almost as serious as the theft itself. The judge gave Malcolm a harsh sentence, 10 years in prison. He was 20 years old. When Malcolm walked into Charlestown State Prison, he was angry. Angry at the world, angry at white people, angry at himself. He was a young man who had been running from something his entire life. Now, locked in a cell, he could not run anymore. He had to face himself. The first months were brutal. Malcolm fought with guards. He spent time in solitary confinement. Other inmates called him Satan because of his hostility toward religion, toward authority, toward everything. He was destroying himself from the inside out. Then something changed. Malcolm's brother, Reginald, came to visit him in prison. Reginald had joined a religious movement called the Nation of Islam, led by a man named Elijah Muhammad. Reginald told Malcolm about the teachings, about black pride, about self-discipline, about the history of African people that had been stolen from them. Malcolm was skeptical at first. He had rejected religion long ago, after watching his mother's faith fail to protect her from poverty and mental illness. But something in Reginald's words resonated with him. He started reading. The prison library became his sanctuary. He read philosophy, history, literature. He taught himself words from the dictionary, copying pages by hand to improve his vocabulary. He read about ancient African civilizations. He read about slavery and colonialism. He read about the systematic oppression of black people in America. The more he read, the more he understood. The anger that had been unfocused and destructive began to transform into something else. Purpose, direction, a mission larger than himself. Malcolm stopped being Satan. He started becoming something new. In 1948, Malcolm wrote his first letter to Elijah Muhammad. He poured out his thoughts, his questions, his desire to understand. Elijah Muhammad wrote back. They began a correspondence that would continue for years. Malcolm adopted the practices of the Nation of Islam. He stopped smoking. He stopped eating pork. He prayed facing east. He changed his name, dropping Little, the slave name given to his ancestors, and replacing it with X. The X represented the African name that had been stolen from his family. Malcolm X was born in a prison cell. When he was released in 1952, he was a completely different person from the young hustler who had knelt on that basement floor in Harlem 7 years earlier. He was disciplined. He was focused. He was dangerous in an entirely new way. Not with guns or fists, but with words, with ideas, with the power of conviction. Malcolm X went to Detroit and then to Chicago, where he met Elijah Muhammad in person for the first time. The leader saw potential in Malcolm. He made him a minister. He gave him a platform, and Malcolm X began to speak. By the late 1950s, Malcolm X had become one of the most recognized voices in America. He spoke about black nationalism, about self-defense, about the hypocrisy of white liberals who preached equality but practiced segregation. He was brilliant, articulate, and uncompromising. The FBI began watching him. Newspapers called him dangerous. But in Harlem, where he established Temple No. 7, Malcolm X was something else entirely. He was a leader, a prophet, a voice for people who had been voiceless for too long. And in Harlem, Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson crossed paths again. It was 1959. Malcolm was 34 years old now, a minister with a growing following. Bumpy was 54, still the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld, though the years and multiple prison sentences had taken their toll. They met at a community event on 125th Street. Malcolm was speaking about economic independence for black communities. Bumpy was in the audience. After the speech, Bumpy approached Malcolm. The years had changed them both, but recognition was immediate. "Malcolm Little," Bumpy said, extending his hand. "Except they don't call you that anymore." Malcolm X shook his hand. "Mr. Johnson, I never got the chance to thank you for that night." Bumpy waved his hand dismissively. "That was a long time ago. Different world. Different people." "I still have your handkerchief," Malcolm said. "I kept it, all through prison." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. Something passed between them, and, understanding that, did not need words. "You did something with your life," Bumpy said finally. "I told you that you were too smart for those streets." "I was right." Malcolm nodded slowly. "You were right. But I had to learn it the hard way. Prison was my university." "Sometimes that's the only way," Bumpy replied. "Some men, they don't hear wisdom. They only hear consequences." They stood there on 125th Street, two men from completely different worlds who had somehow found mutual respect. The Godfather of Harlem and the voice of Black America. A gangster and a preacher. Yet both were fighting for the same thing, in their own ways, the protection of their people. Over the next few years, Malcolm X and Bumpy Johnson maintained a quiet respect for each other. They were not close friends. Their worlds were too different for that. Malcolm preached against the vices that Bumpy profited from: gambling, drugs, the underground economy. Bumpy operated in the shadows that Malcolm sought to illuminate. But they understood each other in a way that few others could. Both had grown up in a world that told them they were worthless. Both had fought their way to power through sheer will and intelligence. Both protected Harlem in their own ways. Bumpy protected it from the Italian mob, from corrupt police, from anyone who tried to exploit the community. Malcolm protected it with ideas, with organization, with a vision of a future where black people did not need men like Bumpy Johnson to survive. In 1963, Malcolm X gave a speech where he talked about the black man's struggle for dignity. A reporter asked him about organized crime in Harlem. Malcolm's answer was careful. "I don't condone criminal activity," he said, "but I understand why it exists. When a system denies people legitimate opportunities, some will create illegitimate ones. The answer is not to condemn the symptom. The answer is to cure the disease." Those who knew both men understood what Malcolm was saying. He was not defending Bumpy Johnson, but he was acknowledging a truth that polite society refused to see. In a world that offered black men nothing, some built empires from whatever materials they could find. Bumpy heard about Malcolm's statement. He smiled when it was reported to him. "The minister understands," Bumpy said to his associates. "He doesn't approve, but he understands. That's more than most." By 1964, however, Malcolm X's world was falling apart. He had broken with the Nation of Islam after discovering that Elijah Muhammad had been unfaithful to his own teachings. Malcolm began receiving death threats. He knew his life was in danger. He made a pilgrimage to Mecca that year, and it transformed him again. He saw Muslims of all races praying together. He began to believe that racial harmony was possible. He changed his name again to El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He started building new organizations with a broader vision, but his enemies were closing in. February 21st, 1965, the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights. Malcolm X took the stage to address his followers. He had barely begun speaking when three men rushed forward from the audience. Gunfire erupted. Malcolm was hit multiple times in the chest. He fell backward onto the stage. He was 39 years old. When Bumpy Johnson heard the news, he was in his office above Small's Paradise. The man who brought the news said that Bumpy sat in silence for a full 5 minutes. He did not speak. He did not move. He just sat there, staring at nothing. Finally, Bumpy said one word. Damn. Those who knew Bumpy understood what that single word contained. Grief. Anger. The weight of lost potential. Malcolm X had been one of the few people who had escaped the gravitational pull of the streets, who had transformed himself into something greater. And now he was dead, shot down by his own people. Bumpy attended Malcolm X's funeral at the Faith Temple Church of God in Christ in Harlem. He sat in the back, dressed in black, his face expressionless. Thousands of people came to pay their respects. Ossie Davis delivered the eulogy, calling Malcolm our own black shining prince. Bumpy did not speak at the funeral. He was not that kind of man. But he paid for flowers. He made sure Malcolm's family was protected in the days after the assassination, when tensions were high and retaliation was possible. He did what he had always done. He protected Harlem, even when Harlem did not know it. In the years after Malcolm's death, Bumpy continued his operations, but those close to him said something had changed. He spoke more often about legacy, about what would remain after he was gone. He had watched too many young men die. He had seen too much potential wasted. He was 60 years old now, and his heart was failing. The doctors told him to slow down. Bumpy ignored them. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson had dinner at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street. It was a place he had frequented for decades. He ordered his usual meal. He talked with friends. He seemed relaxed, even happy. Then, without warning, he clutched his chest. He slumped forward in his chair. By the time the ambulance arrived, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was dead. Harlem mourned its godfather. Thousands attended his funeral at St. Mark's Methodist Church. Politicians came, musicians came. Hustlers and preachers stood side by side. They had all known Bumpy in one way or another. They had all been touched by his protection, his generosity, his iron will. The newspapers called him a gangster, and he was. He ran illegal gambling operations. He fought brutal wars for territorial control. He lived outside the law. But the people of Harlem knew something the newspapers did not understand. In a world that treated black people as less than human, Bumpy Johnson had made them feel powerful. He had stood up to the Italian mob when no one else would. He had paid rent for families who could not afford it. He had kept the worst predators out of Harlem, even as he profited from its vices. He was a complicated man living in complicated times. Among the mourners that day were people who remembered a young hustler named Detroit Red. They remembered how Bumpy had saved him from execution in a basement on 127th Street. They remembered how that young hustler had become Malcolm X, one of the most important voices in American history. Malcolm and Bumpy were both gone now. Both had died in their own ways, products of the world that had shaped them. Malcolm was killed by assassins. Bumpy was killed by his own heart, worn out from decades of stress and struggle. But their legacies remained intertwined. Both had fought for the dignity of black people. Both had refused to bow to a system that demanded their submission. Both had been called criminals by those who feared them. And both had been heroes to those who knew the truth. The story of that night in 1945, the night Bumpy Johnson saved Malcolm Little's life, was passed down through Harlem for generations. It became legend. Some details were embellished over time, as legends always are, but the core remained true. A young man had been given a second chance. He had used that chance to change the world, and the man who gave it to him had never asked for anything in return. That is what true power looks like. Not guns, not money, not territory. The ability to see potential in someone else and give them the chance to fulfill it. Bumpy Johnson saw something in Malcolm Little that night. Maybe he saw himself as a young man, angry and reckless, making enemies he could not afford. Maybe he saw a mind that was too bright to be extinguished in a basement execution. Maybe he just saw a kid who needed help. Whatever he saw, he acted. He paid a debt that was not his. He cut the ropes. He offered advice that Malcolm did not take, at least not immediately. And then he walked away, expecting nothing in return. That is the story they do not tell you in history books. The story of how the Godfather of Harlem and the voice of Black America were connected by a single night, a single act of mercy, a single moment when one man decided that another man's life was worth saving. Bumpy Johnson made a lot of choices in his life. Some were violent, some were illegal, some cost people their lives. But that choice in that basement, in 1945, that choice helped change the world. And that is a legacy worth remembering. Bumpy Johnson saved a lot of people during his life, but none of them went on to shake the foundations of America like Malcolm X did. Think about that for a moment. One decision, one act of mercy, and the entire course of history shifted. What do you think would have happened if Bumpy had not walked into that basement? Would Malcolm have died that night? Would the civil rights movement have lost one of its most powerful voices before he even found it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We are telling the stories that history forgot. The real stories of Harlem. See you in the next one.